Go away. Here we go. Okay. For the people online, I've just talked about the different types of biases that I'll be covering, but this is the first one that I'm talking about, so you haven't missed much. Okay, so if I go back, actually, the first bias that I was talking about is data collection, which is where sampling bias is introduced, and data set can be unrepresentative of wider population. So an example of this is in the UK Biobank, which is the data set that I mainly use. Data was collected from 500,000 people, but invites were sent to 9.2 million, so they had a response rate of about 5%. The response rate was higher in females, old people, and people from more socio-economically affluent areas, which isn't surprising because these are the people with more time to give to donate their data to a study like this. But they're also less likely to be obese, to smoke, to drink on a daily basis, and have different conditions like asthma, diabetes, cancer, hypertension, all these different things. So already they were not a medically representative sample of the people in the UK. But if we were to look at their protected attributes, so for example, their ethnicity, we find that the data set is actually becoming less representative. So the UK Biobank has about 94% white subjects in the data. The time that the study was conceived, it was around the early 2000s, and so they tried to base the ethnic distribution around the census at the time, which was the 2001 census. And you can see that there's 92% white subjects and various smaller percentages of different minorities. So it matched up quite closely. But if you take the most recent census, which was done in 2021, the proportion of white subjects in the population is 82%. So it's quite a big drop, and it no longer is in line with the proportion in the UK Biobank. So to give you a few examples of how this can go wrong, so firstly, AI chatbots, these are a few headlines. So AI chatbots, they mean specifically ChatGPT, perpetuate, here we go, started. Racist debunks medical ideas, which I'll cover towards the end of the presentation. This was quite a famous one. Google tagged two pictures of African Americans as gorillas because their training data set didn't contain enough images of Black people. In America, they were quite fond of using facial recognition in policing, and they found that quite a few people were being arrested and actually doing jail time because of bad facial recognition matches. And lastly, a more medical example, Apple was facing a lawsuit because the PPG sensors that are in Apple Watches, they use light basically to measure things like your blood pressure, your pulse, and they didn't work as well on dark skin tones. So Apple were being sued for this reason because they didn't take into consideration how the products would work on darker skin. So these are all some examples of some sort of headlines that have been thought to have been caused by poor representation in training data. So the second thing I want to kind of discuss is data labeling. So we've already talked about ethnicity, and race and ethnicity are kind of used interchangeably in the UK and the US, but they're both social constructs that were introduced during the transatlantic slave trade. So firstly, race is thought to be linked to biological classification and with physical characteristics. They're defined by your parents. So for example, if you have two white parents, your race is thought to be white, and it's static. So this doesn't change as you move through life. Whereas your ethnicity is based on cultural expression and origin. So it can be defined by your religion or your nationality. So your race could be white, but your ethnicity, for example, could be Christian, I guess. And it can be changed. So as your nationality changes, your ethnicity would also change. But these kind of social constructs fall apart when you consider the fact that there's more variation within subgroups than between them. So there's the out of Africa theory that everyone came from Africa, and there's actually more variation between Black people than there is between different races. So to give this example, if you take me, for example, my nationality is British, my race would be African American, and my ethnicity would be Black Caribbean. And this is because for example, in the US Census, they look at race. So they first of all ask whether you're Hispanic or non-Hispanic, and they filter you down into two separate streams of questions, where they ask if you're Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, for example, and then ask about all other races that are non-Hispanic. But in the UK, we ask about ethnicity. So we ask the broad question whether you're Asian, white, black, and then we filter those down separate categories. So my race and ethnicity based on these two censuses would be completely different. The next sort of bias that I wanted to talk about is assumptions. So let's imagine you wanted to perform a study where you want to see whether exercise is correlated with cardiovascular risk. So you might get some participants and measure before the experiment their blood pressure, height, weight, and BMI, and then get them to do 3 different activities. So you might have a group that's sedentary, a group that does light exercise, and a group that does intense exercise. And then you want to see the effect of this experiment. So afterwards, again, measure their blood pressure, height, weight, and BMI. You would hope that their height didn't change, but you might want to measure it anyway. And to make sure that this experiment is kind of as non-biased as possible, you might control each group for age, sex, and race. The problem with something like this is that you're looking at sort of a biased measure of BMI. So BMI, I hope you know, aims to estimate health risks by measuring obesity. This is the equation for it. But studies have actually found that Black people, for example, have a lower BMI, with similar BMIs have less visceral fat, so less fat around their organs, and that Black and Hispanic people had a lower waist circumference for a given BMI. So their BMI was higher despite them not being as obese as their white counterparts for the same BMI. And so this measure isn't consistent across races, and you're already using a biased measure for your experiment. So to avoid this, you might use some proxies. Like get rid of all of your biased metrics and use something instead that you think is unbiased, like postcode. This is also from the most recent census, and you can see that on the left you have Asian populations, on the right you have white populations, and you can see that they're clustered around certain areas. So there's more Asian people in sort of big cities, for example, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, and it's the opposite for the white population. So they kind of cover more of the other countries, like more areas like the countryside. And so even though you use an unbiased measure like postcode, you can see that it's actually correlated quite well with race. And so the kind of bias can creep in that way as well. One example of how proxies have been used quite ineffectively is one of my favorite examples of the COMPASS algorithm, which stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. And it was originally made by a company called Equivant, and after this happened, they quickly rebranded. But it was made to assess the risk of a defendant reoffending within 2 years. So it's made to help judges decide whether or not someone should be released from prison. And when they first released it, they said, this is great. The accuracy is 67% for white defendants, 64% for Black defendants, so it's fair. But when some non-profits did some more investigating, they found that it, in fact, wasn't fair. So there were higher rates of false positives for Black defendants. So essentially that they were saying that the Black defendants were going to reoffend when they didn't. And there were higher false negatives for the white defendants, so they weren't going to reoffend and they did. And so why did this happen? So they used 21 different parameters in the algorithm, and some of them make sense. So age, gang membership, prior arrests, it's sensible to think that if someone has been arrested for example, 30 crimes, they might commit a 31st. But then there were some variables used that didn't quite make sense. So, for example, if their friends had ever been arrested, if their parents were separated, how often they moved houses, their high school GPA, which is like their grades in school, how much money they had, and my least favorite or favorite one, how often they felt bored or sad, which I think if you were to ask someone, how often are you sad, you're going to commit a crime, it would just be completely ridiculous. So this is one of the ways where proxies can be very much correlated with race. So, for example, how often they moved house can be correlated with race. If their parents are separated, can also be correlated with race, and how biases crept into this algorithm. So this highlights one of the ways that one of the problems with fairness is that it can be evaluated in many ways. So you can use accuracy parity, where there's just equal accuracy between groups, which is what they used originally in this COMPASS algorithm. There's equalized odds, where you have equal true positive and false positive rates. Equalized opportunity, which is just equal true positive rates And lastly, demographic parity, which is where there's equal likelihood of positive outcomes. For this last one, it's easiest to think about it like this. So if you have different numbers of subjects between groups, you just need the percentage or the selection rate to be the same between both. But because fairness can be measured in different ways, there are different costs of having wrong predictions. So for example, in this Compass study, the psychological effect of false reassurance. So for example, the people who were released, there's the false reassurance that they're not going to reoffend, and they do. There's the economic cost of housing more defendants. It's just more expensive. And the personal cost of the people who are kept back in prison having worse outcomes overall than the people who were released. So the next bias is sort of numerical differences. So data sets are often frequently imbalanced. So this is from the UK Biobank, and you can see that, for example, for every one Asian patient, there's 12 white ones. It kind of gets progressively worse until you look at the Chinese subjects, and for every one Chinese person, there's 42 white subjects. And the problem with this is that you can have a very, very imbalanced data set. So if you have, for example, 100 subjects and 99 of them are white, a model can just correctly predict something for the white subjects and have a 99% accuracy and ignore the one minority ethnicity. And you could still report that this is a high performance. And this becomes a problem when these different subgroups have different behaviors. So there's something that you might have heard of called Simpson's paradox, which is where heterogeneous data within different subgroups have different behaviors. And this is a great example because if you look at the two different ages, we're measuring height against basketball success. So you can see if you look at the red and the blue lines, as you get taller, your basketball success improves. You're better at basketball. But if you were to combine the two groups and draw a line of best fit, you can see that basketball success is negatively correlated with height, which is just wrong. We know this to be wrong. So when the overall data is combined, it has a completely different trend. And this can be a problem if you have, firstly, a group that's underrepresented because they can just be ignored. And secondly, if the group has a different behavior. For example, if the underrepresented group has high incidence of a disease. An example of this is this study that found that Black patients produce lower healthcare costs, which doesn't seem right off the bat. But if you, it's a bit hard to see on the screen, but you can see that the purple line is for the Black subjects and the yellow line is for the white subjects. And for a given risk score, the Black subjects actually had a higher number of conditions. So they'd be being given a lower risk score despite being as sick or more sick than their white counterparts. Why was this happening? So healthcare costs are normally correlated with healthcare needs, but the Black and white subjects were receiving different kinds of care. So they found that the Black subjects were being diagnosed later with the same diseases. So they, for a given, let's say, stage 1 of a cancer, you might have 30% of white subjects who were diagnosed with it, but 15% of Black subjects, which makes it seem like they don't have the disease as frequently. But what's actually happening is instead of being diagnosed at stage 1, the Black subjects were being diagnosed much later at stage 3 or 4. The study found that the Black subjects actually received better care from Black physicians, and they theorized this might be because they were being listened to more frequently. And lastly, an accurate algorithm will perpetuate these differences. So the models can only learn from the data that they're given. And so if the data is saying that the Black subjects are, not as in need of healthcare, or that they need to receive different kinds of healthcare, the algorithm will perpetuate this. The last thing I want to talk about is sort of the debate around race-based science and the fact that people are different. So research into physiological differences has historical links to eugenics. This is one of the posters that was used quite often to kind of promote eugenics. But there are a lot of false beliefs that come from, for example, slavery. So skin thickness, lung capacity, and pain management, they were all thought to be different in Black people. So Black people were thought to have a thicker skin so they could withstand more pain, have higher lung capacity so they could do more work. And this was driven by people like Samuel Cartwright, who was a eugenicist. The man was a lunatic, to put it to put it nicely. He didn't believe in germ theory. He proposed this condition called drapetomania, which is was considered a mental illness where slaves actually wanted to be free. He thought that was a absolutely crazy idea, was a mental illness. And he saw forced labor as a way to vitalize the blood to make Black people healthier. And so that's where a lot of these false medical beliefs come from. And I would actually really recommend reading this article. It's a great one about how myths about racial differences, how they came to be. But a lot of these beliefs are still present today. So this was a really interesting study where they looked at white doctors and their assessment of Black people's pain. And they thought that, so for example, if you look at the third row, 40% of first years thought that Black people had thicker skin. 42% of second years, they thought that Black people age more slowly, which is a very commonly heard thing, and that white people were less susceptible to heart disease. These are all incorrect, but you can see that the percentages of the doctors that believe them were quite high, and this is still today. The problem is that algorithms do seem to pick up on slight differences in anatomies. So this is a classification network that was able to predict race from binary images of retinal vessels in the back of your eye. There are some problems with this study, but the algorithm was able to do it. So I don't know if you could guess which, these are from a Black and a white baby. I don't know if you can guess which is which. It's 50-50. So the one on the left was Black and the one on the right was white, which to the human eye, quite literally, but to the human eye, it's impossible to tell, but the model was able to do it. And one of the issues where these biases can kind of appear is the fact that we don't know always how this is happening. So there are different types of machine learning model. For example, there are white box models where the user puts in a request to perform this task. The machine learning model does it, and you don't only get a result, but you also get some sort of an explanation as to why this is happening. So, for example, if you have a decision tree, you can start at the bottom, say, for example, a mammal, and work your way backwards to say, mammal, does the animal lay eggs? No. Does the animal breathe air? Yes. And that's why we got the decision of this animal being a mammal. On the other hand, what we're seeing more and more is black box models, where you have a user request or a task, it goes through the black box model and you get an output, but don't necessarily get the reasoning behind it. And you can see this even with something like ChatGPT. If you were using it when it came out, what was it, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, it would produce something and you wouldn't always get an explanation as to why. And they've kind of integrated reasoning now because it's something that as humans, we want to know why decisions are made. But this is one of the problems of having a black box model, is that it might make a decision, especially a biased decision, and you don't know where this bias is coming from. But there are some ways around it. So this study found that a network that was trained for disease detection from chest x-rays, so for example, pneumonia, COVID, it could predict race with 96% accuracy, which is quite surprising. And they looked at a load of different image features like pixel brightness and bone density and found that none of them could explain how this was happening in the models. But they use an interpretability method called GradCam, which it's a long explanation, but essentially it produces heat maps that tell you which parts of the image the network is looking at. And this helps us to understand what is being focused on and why, and which parts of the image are being used. So there are some methods that can be used to sort of illuminate what these models are looking at. So what are the main takeaways? One, data set representation is essential. The model can only learn from what it sees. And so if it doesn't see something in the data set, it'll never learn from it. If you showed a child only pictures of dogs, it wouldn't know what a cat is. An important thing to consider is how is representation measured? Is it by the number of people in a specific area? Is it by the national population? Is it by the people who it will be applied to? It's important things to define before you start doing a study. Are the assumptions valid, and are you using proxies? For example, as we looked at postcode, is it something that's correlated with a protected attribute? Do the groups exhibit the same behavior? Because you might end up with something like Simpson's paradox, where you combine the data sets together and end up with some behavior that's not representative of either group. And lastly, check the biology. Are these groups different, and are they meant to be? And is this something that the model is going to learn from? It's not all kind of doom and gloom. There are some things that are being done to sort of address these problems. So there's something called the Future AI Guiding Principles, and this is just one of the sort of guidelines that's been proposed. So you can see why it's called Future AI. It's the first letters. So first of all, continuous fairness monitoring. Once a model is deployed, you want to make sure that it remains fair for the people it's being deployed on. So for example, UK Biobank, we saw how that data set is becoming unrepresentative over time. Universality, you want to be standardizing data sets and software so that they can be used across multiple populations and in different places. Very importantly, traceability, documenting the provenance of not just data sets, but the model, who worked on it, why did they work on it, who had access to it. Usability, so things like usability testing are essential for making sure that both clinicians and patients actually are able to use something and understand how it works. Robustness, one of the sort of factors of this is training on heterogeneous data. If you train on a population that's all the same, it's not going to be very robust to things that it hasn't seen. And lastly, explainability, which we covered briefly at the end. It's essential to making sure that clinicians know what's going on, and patients as well. I think if we walked into a doctor's surgery and they said, we're going to use this model, but we can't explain how it works, people wouldn't have a lot of trust in it. So explainability is also crucial. And there are a few resources that I really like that I wanted to share. So there's a database called the AI Algorithmic Accidents, Incidents, and Controversies. A really long title, but it's a database that looks at, as it says, accidents, incidents, and controversies to do with AI. And this isn't just with things like hospitals, but it's also with private companies, Google, Facebook, Meta, and how they've used AI and how it's gone wrong. And they do great work keeping track of all these things so that they don't go fly under the radar. There's the Fairness and Machine Learning book, which is free online if you want to know more, not just about machine learning, but about the field of fairness. There's also this page that I think is a GitHub page, but it takes you step by step through different fairness sort of definitions, and it has the compass algorithm there if you wanted to go more in depth about that. This is a really good article that I quite liked about the historical foundations of race and where we get those terms from, and how they can be combined or not or misused. It's a great article. And I think this is the last one. This, if you're not much of a reader and prefer watching stuff, there's a Netflix documentary called Coded Bias, where they talk about, it's more based in America. They talk about algorithmic biases to do with things like finance, housing, policing. And it's made by a lady called Joy Buolamwini, who wrote a paper that kind of kick-started the field of fairness for a lot of people, because it became very famous. It was called Gender Shades. It was about facial recognition, and how it was biased. She explains it in the documentary. I'd recommend watching it. And that's it from me. Thank you. Oh yeah, do you want to do questions now? Wow, I must have explained everything so well.
Yeah.
No? Um, that's a big question. So there are a few different things. I think speaking for the AI models themselves, I think, as I was saying, the main takeaway is training with more diverse data is one of them. knowing who's in the data and which protected attributes you look at, because there are that list at the beginning, there's quite a few of them, and if you can split people into kind of almost infinite subgroups, but looking at sort of the main ones and doing some like intersectional analysis, so not just looking at age or sex, but looking at older Black women or younger white men. That's one way to kind of find out where the biases lie. There's also bias mitigation methods that I didn't mention in here, where you can sort of address some of the biases that you see. So something that I found in my work that will hopefully be published soon is oversampling. So if you have a really small group of minority subjects, you can oversample them so that they're of in equal proportion to the wider group. And that helps to bring performance up for those people, because although you're not showing the model any new information, they are putting more importance on that underrepresented group. So there are different ways of mitigating biases. But I think it's yeah. So I would agree with this, but from my experiments, it seems like no, because we just over. So I had 15 black subjects and 4,000 white subjects, so there was a massive imbalance there, and I just oversampled them so that for each batch, for example, there were 10 black subjects and 10 white subjects. So essentially, all of the data that I had, and just kept showing the model that, and it massively improved, like significantly improved performance.
Left out episode.
Mhm. Yeah. So it does
try
work.
to apply like the noise that exists in the like largely sampled group to the undersampled group, like when you oversample it. Like if there are certain variation that comes with like sex and age, for example, and you're like looking at race, you could apply like the same inter-participant differences that come with age and sex to like the less sampled race group. Like,
Yeah.
That
This is-
assumes that they would have the same changes.
Yeah, I guess you'd have to have like a trial for that.
This is one of the issues. So there are some things that we know that are different. So there are some structures of the heart that, for example, because I mainly look at black and white subjects in my work. So there are some things that we know are different. So like the left ventricle, the mass there is larger for black people than for white people on average. So there's some things that we know to be different, but there are also some things that you don't expect to be different, like the example with the retinas, or the chest X-rays, that do appear to be different. So a lot of work needs to be done to kind of figure out why.
What was different about this? Actually, the Veronica talked a while back about like there being other things. Was it a biological thing that it was focusing on, or was it something?
So their theory was that I think that the actual vessels were slightly bigger in the black subjects, like the vessels were wider.
Did you have any interpretability?
No, not that I remember in the paper. Any other questions?